Shalom. We are continuing our limud of Sefer Melachim Aleph, and we are now getting to perhaps one of the most difficult perakim in Nach, just to understand it well, and that is the building of the first Beis HaMikdash, the Beis HaMikdash of Shlomo HaMelech, that lasted for 410 years until it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And it's important to know that the model of the Bayis Rishon is largely based on the Mishkan, but the Bayis Sheni was a little different than the Bayis Rishon, and the Bayis Sheni is, of course, described in the Mishnah Maseches Midas, and both of them are different than the Bayis Shlishi, which should be built Mehera V'Yameinu L'Maisa Mashiach. That is in the book of Yecheskel. So there are going to be some differences. And as I say, anytime you describe an architectural building without seeing a picture, it is very, very difficult. And different Meforshim have many different approaches, and there are some psukim that we don't have a clear understanding of. But I will be basing my translations largely on a combination of Rashi and the Malbim. The Malbim especially is very, very clear in terms of what the different expressions in the psukim mean. But once again, keep in mind that if you look in some other translation, Art Scroll or Judaic Press, you may not see exactly what I'm saying because they're not necessarily basing it on the Malbim. So Perek Vav Pasuk Aleph begins, Vayhi b'shmeinim shana v'yarba me'ay shana lotzeis b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim Bashana haravias b'chaydesh ziv, hu hachaydesh hasheni limloch shlomo al Yisrael, vayiven habayis lashem. So this is a very, very important pasuk that is actually the cornerstone of a lot of biblical chronology. And that says that Shlomo began to build the Beis HaMikdash 480 years after we left Mitzrayim. Now, this is important because that actually tells us we were 440 years, or it was the 440th year since we came to Eretz Yisrael, because we came to Eretz Yisrael 40 years after Yetzias Mitzrayim. So remember these numbers, 480 from Yetzias Mitzrayim and 440 from Biat Ha'aretz, and that is when Shlomo began to build the Beis HaMikdash. It was in the 4th year of his reign, B'chaydesh Ziv, in the month of Ziv. Now Ziv was an original name for the month of Iyar, because Ziv is kind of a shining or a radiance, and that is, it's already the spring, and the flowers begin to shine, and the flowers begin to grow. So the older name for Iyar was Chaydesh Ziv. The older name, even than that, was Chaydesh Hasheni. Later, the names Iyar, Nisan, these are Babylonian names that we acquired in the Golus Bavel, but at this time it was called Chodesh Ziv, so it was Iyar of the 4th year of Shlomo's reign, which is HaChodesh Hasheni Lamloch Shlomo Yisana. It was the 2nd month of his year, because once again, as the Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah, Nisan is the beginning of a new year for a Melech, and Mimele, Iyar is the Chodesh Hasheni of that 4th year. Vayiven habayis lashem, and Shlomo began to build the Beis HaMikdash. V'habayis asher bana hamelech Shlomo lashem shishim ama orkai. So now we're given the dimensions. Now again, remember what we have here. We have a courtyard, which is called a chotzer, and in the Mishnah it's called the Azara. And in that courtyard we have the Mizbeach of the Korbanos, as well as the Kior to wash our hands. And then as you walk through the Chotzer, you reach a building with a roof, and that building is called the Heichal. And in the front part of the Heichal, you have the golden Mizbeach of Ketores, you have the Shulchan of the Lechem Apanim, you have the Menorah, and if you keep on walking, you will come to a Pareiches and the Kodesh HaKadoshim that is in the Heichal. Once you're past the Heichal, you then have the back part of the Chotzer, because the Chotzer surrounds the Heichal on all 4 sides. So we have Heichal, so we have Chotzer, we have Heichal, and the back part of the Heichal is the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So when it says bias, we are referring to the dimensions of the Heichal, including the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So the bias, the entire bias, not counting the Chatzir, that Shlomo HaMelech built for Hashem, Shishim Ama Orkai, 60 amos in length. That means going from east to west, from the entrance of the Heichal to the back of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. But we're only looking at interior space. We're not counting the thickness of the wall. Is 60 amos. Again, an amma is between 1.5 feet or 2 feet. Esrim Rachbo, north and south, was only 20 amos. Again, this is interior space, not counting the thickness of the walls. Ushloshim ama komato. And from the floor to the ceiling, again, not counting the thickness of the floor or the thickness of the ceiling, was 30 amos. So 60 going from east to west, 20 going from north to south, and 30 going up. Now, in reality, Divrei Hayamim adds that this is only the first story where they did the Avaida. There, in fact, was a second story which is not mentioned in the book of Malachim, although it is mentioned in Divrei Hayamim. Now, in front of the Heichal was a hallway, a chamber, a separate structure that functioned as a hallway or an antechamber before you entered the Heichal, and this is called the Ulam. Ulam means the hall. There was an Ulam al Pnei Heichal Abayis. There was an Ulam in front of the Heichal. Esrim Ama Orkai al Pnei Reichav Abayis. It was 20 amos north-south, so it was aligned with the width of the bayis. And it was Eser Bi'ama Rachba al Pnei Abayis. And in front of the bayis, meaning eastward, east of the bayis, east of the Heichal, it was 10 amos. So the Heichal is described as the Ulam is described as an antechamber that is 20 by 10. And based on this description, it did not extend beyond the Heichal, because the 20 amos was in the north-south, which is exactly the width of the Heichal. However, we do know from the Mishnah in Midas that the Ulam had further extensions going beyond the Heichal, and those further extensions were called Beit HaChalifot. That is where they stored the knives that they used to shecht korbanos. But again, I don't think we have a raya that even existed in the Bayis Rishon, and in any event, the Beit HaChalifos is not mentioned in the book of Malachim. Okay, so we've described so far the Heichal and the Ulam. Now we mention a further thing, Vayas Labayis Chalunei Shikufim Atumim, that across the walls of the Heichal there were windows. But the windows had an unusual configuration. Usually a window might be narrower on the outside and wider on the inside. Remember, windows in those days didn't have glass. They were just hollow openings, because that way the light expands outwards. But in the Beis HaMikdash it was the opposite. The windows were wide on the outside and they narrowed on the inside, as if to say the Beis HaMikdash gives light to the world. The Beis HaMikdash does not need light from the world. And therefore, shikufim, they were wide on the outside, atumim, but they were kind of sealed on the inside, the opposite of normal windows. Okay, so that's the Ulam and the Heichal. Now, the next thing is describing ta'im. Ta'im, or a ta', is simply a chamber or an office or a storehouse that along the side walls of the Heichal, on three sides, on the north, on the south, and on the west, not on the east, because the east is the entrance to the Heichal, rooms were built running along the side, and we're going to see there were 3 stories of rooms, and these are called ta'im, and each ta was 5 amos high, so that would mean that the ta'im were 15 amos along the wall, which in turn was 30 amos, right? So basically, you would have on 3 sides, half of the Heichal's walls were adjacent to these ta'im. And how did the ta'im work? Vayiven al kira bayit adjacent to the walls of the Heichel on three sides, the north, south, and west. Yotzia saviv es kirot habayis saviv laheichel v'ladvir. Ta'im, chambers that surrounded not only the front part of the Heichel, but the devir, that means including the Kodesh HaKadoshim on the outside. V'yas salo saviv, they became like ribs on the side. Now, here it mentions in Pasuk Vav, Hayotzia hatachtona chamesh b'yama rachba. The internal space of the lower ta'ah, because there are 3 stories, was 5 amos wide. Hatichona, the interior space of the middle ta'ah, on top of that, was sheish b'yama, was 6 amos wide, rachba. And shlishis, and the third, is sheva b'yama rachba. So each ta'ah was 5 amos high, 3 ta'im. Again, you have a succession of rooms. But the bottom was 5 amos wide, the middle was 6 amos wide, and the top one was 7 amos wide. Now, how did this work? So let me explain this. The pasuk will tell us. And that is, the roof of these ta'im are cedar planks. Now, normally, you would drill into the stone walls so the planks would be inserted into the stone walls of the Heichel. But Shlomo HaMelech had a policy that no metal tools would be used in the cutting of the walls of the Heichel once those stones are there. Yeah, you can use metal tools to excavate. Now, the truth of the matter is, this is a chumrah. This was a hanhaga of Shlomo. According to halacha, it is only the avnei mizbeach that cannot be cut with stones. It does not refer to the walls of the Heichel. But Shlomo did not want to use any metal to cut the walls of the Heichel, because the Beis HaMikdash was created for life, and metal represents taking away life by swords. So as a result, how do you take the wooden beams that are the roof of the ta'im, and how do you make them secure when they rest on the walls of the Heichel if there are no holes you can make in the walls of the Heichel? And the ingenious answer that he came up with, I shouldn't say he came up with because everything is al pi nevuah, navi, is that the wall itself would be indented. So that would mean the following. The first ta'ah, which is on the ground level, is 5 amos high. At the point of the wall of the Heichel that is 5 amos, an indentation was made of 1 amma. So as a result, the beams were not inserted in holes, but the beams were secure because they were resting on an amma of the wall that jutted out. Because the wall indented. Now this is only outside. Inside, that did not change the interior space. The wall was thick enough that even with these indentations, you did not intrude into the interior. Now, if that means that the 5 amma roof of the bottom ta'ah was resting on an amma of indented wall, when you constructed your second ta'ah that was flush with the first ta'ah, you now have 6 amos of space. You have the 5 amos plus the extra amma of indentation that now is part of the floor, so to speak, right? It is now the floor of the second ta'ah. Now, for the third ta'ah, it's the same thing. The beams of the second ta'ah were secured by indenting the wall yet a second time, thereby giving you 6 amos of interior space, and the beams were resting on an amma, and that means the third ta'ah is now 7 amos wide, and its roof, in turn, would be resting on a further indentation of 8 amos, but there was no ta'ah above that. So through the process of indentation, each ta'ah was 1 amma wider than the other ta'ah, although on their extremity, they were flush. Right, the 3 ta'im were flush in that way. And that's what the pasuk says, migraot. So these are the migraot, the indentations, nasan lebayit saviv. He put around the bayit, chutza, levilti achos b'kirot habayit, in order that the beams, which were the roofs of the ta'im, would not be inserted into the actual walls, which would require cutting them with metal and the like. And that's what Pasuk Zion says. V'habayis bihi banaso. When the Beis HaMikdash was built, when the Heichal was built, Even Shalema Masa Nivna. The stones were shalem from the time that they were transported from the quarry. Meaning to say, in the quarry itself, unlike the Avnei Mizbeach that could not be cut, the stones were cut. The miraculous shamir may have been used for the Mizbeach. It didn't have to be used for the Avnei Heichal. But once the stones were cut and they were polished and they were cut to the right dimension, there was no further metal cutting that was done in the Heichal itself. Makavot v'garzen, axes and saws, and kol kli barzel, and any iron tools. Lo nishma babayit. See, it's meduik. Was not heard in the house as the house was being built, and that is why he had to have the migraot for the ta'im. So again, the ta'im are a series of rooms that run across the north and the west and the south, and there are 3 stories of those rooms, and the migraot were the indentations in the wall of the Heichal that allowed the beams to be supported without making holes. Now, it then mentions, Pasuk Ches, Pesach Hatzela Tichona El Kesav Abayis HaYamanit, the entrance to the Ta'im, not to the Heichal, the entrance to the Ta'im, it says, was on the right side of the house, of the Heichal. Now, what is the right of the Heichal? So here we're assuming that although when you enter the Heichal you're going east-west, east is normally assumed to be the dominant direction in Tanakh. So whenever we talk about right, we are assuming someone that is facing east. So if you're facing east, right is south. So as a result, the entrance to the Ta'im was on the south side. Uba lulim, and through ropes, or actually a staircase, yalu ala tichona, you would go from the bottom to the middle. Umin atichona, and from the middle you would go to the 3rd story. In other words, you entered at the ground level, and then you were able to climb up to the higher levels. Okay, so that was the discussion of the Ta'im. Now we go back to the Heichal itself. Vayiven es habayis. The bayis was built, that is the Heichal, including Kodesh HaKadoshim, V'echaleya, which was finished. Vayispain, through stone, so it was built by stone, this was stone. Vayispain es habayis, gevim usteirot be'arazim. And then the ceiling of the bayis was not stone, but the ceiling of the bayis were cedar planks, and there were multiple levels of the cedar planks. The gevim is the other way. Steirot is the lower ceiling, and then there were planks on top of that, which are called gevim. Now, vayiven es hayotzia. Now the ta'im were built around the walls of the Heichal. I'll call abayis chamesh amos kamas. As we indicated, it was 5 amos high, and there were 3 levels of ta'im, so that's 15 amos. And then vayechaz es habayis batzei arazim, and they too, their roofs were cedar wood, and that was the migraot. Vayihi devar Hashem el Shlomo lemar, and then Hashem spoke to Shlomo. This means either through nevuah, through a navi giving him a message, or through a ruach hakodesh, or through a chalaim. And Hashem gave him a promise while he was building the mikdash. Habayis hazeh asher ata baina, this bayis that you are building. Im telech b'chukosai, if you walk in my laws, v'eshmishpatai tasen, you keep my mishpatim, v'shamartes kol mitzvosai lo lechas, in other words, if you will keep the Torah, v'hakimaisi es devari itach asher dibarti el David avicha, I will keep my promise that I made to David, that you and your children will always be the melachim of Am Yisrael. V'shachanti b'toich b'nei Yisrael, and my Shekhinah will always remain with b'nei Yisrael if they keep the mitzvahs. In other words, there wouldn't have been a chorban. Meaning Hashem is basically saying, you keep the mitzvahs, my Shekhinah will be with you. V'loi ezoiv es ami Yisrael. I will not forsake my nation, Am Yisrael. So going back to the construction, Vayiven Shlomo es habayis, V'echeleh Shlomo built the bayis, he finished it. Vayiven es kirot habayis mibaisa, Bitsalos arazim, Mikarka habayis ad kiros hasipun, Sipa eitz mibayis. So now, Pasuk Tesvav is teaching me a new detail. The walls of the Heichal and the Kodesh HaKodashim were stone. They were stone. They were not wood. But inside, he put wood over the stone. Meaning to say, the walls of the bayis inside were covered with cedar boards. Mikarka habayis, from the floor, ad kirot hasipun, until the roof. Tzipa eitz mibayis. He covered the gold with eitz. And in addition, vayitzafis karka habayis b'salos baroshim. And the floor was cypress wood. Again, I don't really know why the walls are cedar and the floor are cypress. They're different trees, but this is what the pasuk says. Okay, so the point that we're making is that although on the outside the walls were stone, on the inside there was wood paneling of very, very good wood, cedar wood, and cypress wood on the floor. Now, then it says, what about the Kodesh HaKodashim? So here we have a kasha. Vayiven es esrim ama meyarkasei habayis b'tsalot arazim in akarka akirot. And the last 20 amas, because remember, the Heichal is 60 altogether, but 40 is the front, and the last 20 by 20 is the Kodesh HaKodashim. So here it's making the point that the same wood paneling that was done within the Heichal was also done in the Kodesh HaKodashim. Vayiven es esrim ama miyarksei habayis, the last 20 amos at the end of the Heichal was also paneled with salot arazim, with cedar boards, min akarka ad akirot, from the ground until the roof. Vayiven lo mibayis lidvir lekodesh HaKodashim, and this section became known as the Devir, which is also called the Kodesh HaKodashim. And the Arboim ba'ama haya habayis hu ha'heichal lefaneh. So the way it worked is, the Heichal is 60 amos going from east to west. I'm sorry, 60 amos going from, 60 amos going from east to west. The first 40 amos were the Heichal, and the last 20 amos are the Kodesh HaKodashim. So the Heichal, before you get to the Kodesh HaKodashim, is 40 by 20. The Kodesh HaKodashim is 20 by 20. And then it says, the Erez el Abayis Panima, the cedar that was paneling the stone walls, both in the Heichal and in the Kodesh HaKodashim, Miklas Pikaim Upeturei Tzitzim, Hakol Erez Ein Even Nira. So it was engraved on the wood all sorts of beautiful designs, flowers, shoshanim, chains, various circles, ropes, things that look very, very decorative. And they were both engraved and also coming out, being bolate, on the Erez walls. And it makes the point, Hakol Erez. If you're standing inside of the Heichal, everything was cedar, Ein Even Nira, you would not see any stone at all. Now then, that's the Heichal. What about the Kodesh HaKodashim? Udevir b'toch habayis mepnima hichin. Shlomo prepared, al pi nevuah, the inner chamber of the Heichal, and that, with the purpose of that, was to be the Kodesh HaKodashim, Lasitein sham es aron bris Hashem, that is where the Aron HaKodesh is going to be placed. V'lifnei hadvir, so here lifnei hadvir means within the Kodesh HaKodashim, not in front of, but within the Kodesh HaKodashim, was esrim ama oirich, was 20 amos 20 by 20 length and width. But here we have a kasha, and it says, Esrim ama kaimasai. 20 by 20 by 20. Now, this number is actually shver, because we are told that the whole heichal is 60 by 20 by a height of 30. So until you get to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, it is 40 by 20 at a height of 30. The Kodesh HaKadoshim would therefore be 20 by 20, that's fine, but it should be 20 by 20 by 30, because the height of the Heichal is 30. So how could the Pasuk say that the height of the Kodesh HaKadoshim was only 20 amos, Esrim Amma Kaimasai, when it should have been 30 amos? So some actually learn, this is a big chiddush, some Meforshim actually learn that the height of the Kodesh HaKadoshim was lower than the Heichal. It's as if to say, the Heichal was 30 amos high, and then it sloped down to a Kodesh HaKadoshim that was 20 by 20, and only 20 amos high. Right, that's how some Meforshim learn. The Malbim, however, learns differently, because when the Pasuk goes on and says 20 amos high, and the Kodesh HaKadoshim was covered in gold, meaning to say you had stone, and you had wood, and then you had gold, but some want to say that the gold only covered 20 out of the 30 amos of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and the remaining 10 amos had precious jewels like diamonds and rubies and sapphires. So when it says the height was 20, it means the height that was covered with gold. So be it as it may, what the Pasuk is now telling me is that in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but now we'll see it was actually in the Heichal as well, but at least this Pasuk is telling me that in the Kodesh HaKadoshim itself, the wood was paneled over the stone, and then the wood, in turn, was covered by gold for a height of 20 out of the 30 amos. And then, parenthetically, although this does not belong here at all, it's very shver, Vayitzav Mizbeach Eretz. That in the Heichal, not in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, in the Heichal, there was the Mizbeach of Ketores, and that too was made initially out of cedar wood, which in turn would be covered by gold. Rashi raises the question, since the size of this Mizbeach is the same size as the Mizbeach HaKateres of the Mishkan, why was it necessary to make a new Mizbeach HaKateres of the Bayis? Why couldn't you use Moshe's Mizbeach? Bishlama, the outer Mizbeach for Korbanos, is much, much larger, so Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach couldn't be used. But why couldn't it be used for the Mizbeach HaKateres? Okay. Pasuk Chaf Aleph, Vayitzav Shlomo Zabayis Mipnima Zahav Sagor. So now we're making the point that not only did he cover the walls of the Kodesh HaKadoshim with gold, but he covered the walls of the whole Heichal with gold. So everything was gold. V'yaver baratuko lifnei advir, and in front of the Kodesh HaKadoshim there were chains of gold covered with gold. Now, here we have to understand something. You have stone walls, there's wood paneling, but on the wood paneling were engraved all sorts of designs. But if you then cover the wood paneling with gold, isn't that going to cover up the designs? So the Pasuk will make clear, again, in a few Pasukim we're going to read this, that they hammered the gold. Now here they did use a hammer. That is very, very interesting. It's a good kasha. They wouldn't use hammers to cut or break, but to flatten they did use, even in the construction of the Heichal. They hammered it so that the gold would go down whenever there was a design that was shokeya, and therefore the designs would be visible through the indentations in the gold. Okay, but ultimately, you walked in, you would see gold walls. that the whole heichal on the inside was covered with gold. These are the walls. And similarly, and the incense altar that was in front of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which only Keteris was brought, even though it was constructed of Eitz Erez, but Sipa Zahav, it was covered with gold. Okay, so stone, cedar wood, gold. Now we're going to go back into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Vayas badvir shnei keruvim matzei shaman. So here I need to explain a little bit. We know that the Aron HaKodesh, and this is the Aron HaKodesh of Moshe Rabbeinu, had on top of the Aron HaKodesh a gold cover that is called a kapores, and on top of the gold cover are two keruvim, two childlike angelic figures, whose wings are over the Aron HaKodesh and are touching each other. And these angels represent the purity of children, and they are a sign of love that Hashem has for Am Yisrael. But what's interesting is, in addition to the keruvim on top of the Aron that are relatively small, and they are part of the design of the Aron going all the way back to the Mishkan, Shlomo HaMelech created very tall keruvim that are standing on the ground. In other words, at the side of the Aron, you have these two tall keruvim whose wings, once again, are over the Aron HaKodesh. And that's, so this pasuk is not talking about the keruvim on top of the kapores. They are talking about standing keruvim on either side of the ark. And we're going to see as well that the configuration of their wings is very, very different. Vayas badvir, in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, Shlomo made, actually he didn't make, but he commanded to be made, Shnei Keruvim, two angelic figures, Atzei Shaman, that were made out of olive wood, Eser Amais Kaimasai. Each Keruv was 10 amos high. 10 amos, 10 amos. Now remember, the Kodesh HaKadoshim is either 30 amos high or 20 amos high, depending on how you learn it, but these Keruvim are 10 amos. Now, Chamesh amot knav hakruv achas, v'chamesh amot knav hakruv hashenit, eser amos miksos knafav ad ksos knafav. And the keruvim, each keruv had two wings, and the wings were stretched out, and one wing was 5 amos, and the other wing was 5 amos. So when the wings are stretched out, from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other wing of one keruv is already 10 amos. Now again, the Gemara points out that obviously this is not quite right, because you also have the body of the keruv. So you see that somehow miraculously the body of the keruv did not take up any space, and therefore one wing is 10. I'm sorry, one wing is 5, the other wing is 5, so the wings are 10. And similarly for the other keruv, Eser biyama keruv hasheni, mida achas v'ketzef echad l'shnei hakruvim. The keruvim were all identical in size. So the way it worked was this. This is different, unlike the keruvim on top of the ark, whose wings were just covering the Aron, were not going outwards, with the keruvim that were on the side of the ark, the way it worked was, one wing touched the wall of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the other wing stretched over the Aron, the second keruv, one wing touched the wall of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and the second was over the Aron. So the two wings, one wing of one keruv and one wing of the other keruv touched, but the other wings were touching the Aron, which actually means, in other words, that the wingspan of the keruvim took up the entire width of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, because the Kodesh HaKadoshim is 20 amos. So the first wing of the keruv is 5 amos, the second is 5, the other keruv is 5 and 5. 5, 5, 5, 5, 20. The whole reichav of the Kodesh HaKadoshim is only 20 amos, and the wingspan took up that entire width. Again, why it repeats it, that we don't really have a good pshat. The height of one kruv is 10 amos, v'chein kruv hasheni. Vayitin es hakruvim b'toch habayis hapnimi. The kruvim were put in the inner chamber, the kodesh hakdashim. Vayifresu es kanfei hakruvim. The wings were spread out. Vatiga kanaf echad bakir. One wing touched the wall of the kodesh hakdashim. Uchnaf hakruv hasheni. And the wing of the second kruv touched the other wall of the Kodesh HaKdashim. V'kanfeim, and the two inner wings were stretched over the Aron, and they were no-gos, knaf el knaf, and they touched at their edges. So the kruvim were initially made of olive wood, but they too were coated in gold. Vayitzav es hakruvim zahav. Again, this is different than the kruvim of Moshe. The kruvim on top of the papyrus are solid gold. They're not wood covered in gold. But the kruvim shasa shlomo is atse shamen, olive wood covered in gold. Now, v'es kol kiros habayis, the walls of the heichal and the kodesh hakdashim, mesav kala pituchei miklos kruvim b'timaros u'b'tirei tzitzim. Again, there's a lot of repetition. It's hard to come up with a pshat here, but it emphasizes they were engraved with images of kruvim, so the kruvim were also images on the wood. B'timarot, palm trees, b'tirei tzitzim, flowers, milifnim, both in the kodesh hakdashim, v'lachitzon, and in the heichal. And again, we're going to see that they beat the gold so that the gold would allow you to still see the various tsuros, not in their colors, but at least in their designs. V'yas karka habayis sipazav, and similarly the floor, not the ceiling remained wood, but the floor that was cypress wood was also covered with gold. La pnima, both in the Kodesh HaKdashim, v'lachitzon, and in the heichal. Now, v'yas pesach hadvir, the entrance to the Kodesh HaKdashim, asa dalsais atse shamen, had two adjacent doors, made of olive wood. Now, let me explain this. In the Mishkan, and in the second Beis HaMikdash, there was no door to the Kodesh HaKdashim. You just had a curtain that was called a paroches. In the Mishkan, you only had one paroches. In the Bayis Sheni, which is described in the Mishnah in Yuma, you had two parocheses, but there was a paroches. But in the first Mikdash, things were very different. In the first Mikdash, the separation between the Heichal and the Kodesh HaKdashim actually had a wall that was 1 amma thick. 1 amma thick. It's called amma traxin. And in that wall, there were two doors side by side, not one in back, side by side, two doors of Atzei Shamen. And behind the door, there was a paroches. So, basically, the doors were there, but they were always open. The doors were never closed. If you would be standing in front of the Kodesh HaKdashim, you would see two open doors and a paroches in the Amma Traxin. And then it mentions an interesting architectural detail, Ho'ayel mezuzot chamishit. The door posts upon which these doors were attached had an unusual shape. They had a pentagon shape, meaning if you imagine a normal doorpost, we're not counting the top and the bottom. A normal doorpost is a square, right? You have four surfaces. It's like a block of wood, a square block of wood. Actually, the height is higher, but whatever it would be. So that is called a four-sided doorpost. So a standard doorpost is four-sided. But here, l'chavod the Kodesh HaKdashim, they made it a little different. There was, a back and a side, which is three. But the side in which the door was attached kind of came out and then was carved, so it formed a point, making it a pentagonal doorpost, and that's what it means by Ayel Mezuzot Chamishit. Ushnei dalsos atzei shamen, the two doors of olive wood. Again, kol aleim miklaot kruvim v'timarot u'pterei tzitzim. They too had the decorations of the cherubs and the palm trees and the flowers. V'tzipa zahav, and these doors were also covered with gold. But here it says, Vayared ala kruvim v'ala timarot es hazahav. The gold was beaten downward, so they did use hammers for this type of beating, on the kruvim and on the designs, so you could see the designs even with the gold. Now, this is only said so far with respect to the doors, but in fact this was equally true for the walls of the Heichal and the walls of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Okay, the Navi will make that clear later. Now, why we're not told that detail first? There are many, many kashas. I'm just trying to understand the picture here, and I hope that I'm successfully communicating it. But as to why different details are not given until later, that's something that I simply do not have a complete answer for. But now, so we have the two doors of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and what about the doors of the Heichal? V'chein asa lepesach ha'heichal, for entering the Heichal, and you remember you're entering it from the east, mezuzot atzei shamen, there were doorposts, but unlike the doorposts of the Kodesh HaKadoshim that were five-sided, this was meyes revi'is. These were four-sided, standard four-sided doorposts, again, four sides, not counting the top and the bottom. But another difference, besides the 4 and the 5, ushtei dalsot atzei baroshim, that here you had two doors of cypress wood, not cedar wood. Shnei tzilaim hadelas oachat gelilim, ushnei koloim hadelas hashenis gelim. So this is a little different, meaning to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you just had one doorway with two doors that were open. With the Heichal, you had outer doors and inner doors. Two outer doors, and then you'd walk through a little bit, and then two inner doors. So each door had two components. And once again, we had these designs on them. Vayiven v'kala hakruvim timras v'turei tzitzim v'tzipa zav miyushar ala mechuka. Once again, you had images, you had engravings of the cherubs and the date palms and the flowers, and the doors were covered with gold, miyushar ala mechuka, going into the engraving so you could see the engravings. So again, this idea of beating the gold, so you could see the engravings. So far we've mentioned it only with respect to the doorways of the Kodesh HaKadoshim and the doorways of the Heichal. But as I said, this actually would be true for the walls of the Heichal and the Kodesh HaKadoshim as well. So we have described the Heichal, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Ta'im, the doorways. Now, the Heichal is situated in a courtyard, and in that courtyard, most of the Avodah was done. Most of the Avodah was not done in the Heichal. The Korban Tamid, the Korban Musaf, all of these things were brought in the Chatzer, which had the Mizbeach of Korbanos, and this is a new Mizbeach, because the Mizbeach is going to be much larger than Moshe's Mizbeach. And now we're describing the inner Chatzer. The inner Chatzer is called the Azora, and this is where the Avodah was done. There was an outer Chatzer, but that's not really discussed in the book of Malachim. Vayiven es ha-Chatzer ha-Pnimis, the inner Chatzer where the Mizbeach was. In the Bayis Sheni, this was called Ezras Yisrael and Ezras Kaihanim, and this is east of the Ulam. Vayiven es ha-Chatzer ha-Pnimis, Sholosha Turei Gazit, V'tor Karusot Arazim. So there's no gold here. The wall was built, 3 rows of stone, a row of cedar, 3 rows of stone, a row of cedar. So it was a mixture of stone and wood, 3 stone, cut stone, this is cut stone, and 1 cedar. And that was the wall around the Chatzer in which they brought the Korbanos. And then finally we're given a timetable, Bashana Harav, as we said before, it was in the 4th year of Shlomo's reign, Yusad Beis Hashem, the foundation was laid for the Beis HaMikdash, and that was B'Yerech Ziv, that was in the month of Ziv, the month of radiance, which is the older term for the month of Iyar. And how long did it take to build? Ubashana ha'achas esrei. So it took 7 years. He began building in year 4 of his reign, and it was not completed until the 11th year of his reign, in the month of Bul. Now, Bul is the older name of Cheshvan, and it's connected to Bul as a contraction of Mabul, because number 1 is the beginning of the rainy season, and number 2, we paskin that was the beginning of the flood in the time of Noach, and that is the Chodesh Hashmini. It is the 8th month of the Jewish calendar if you're counting from Nisan. So Tishrei is month 7, and Cheshvan would be month 8. Kolo Habayis, the Beis HaMikdash was finished. L'chol Devarav, according to all of its requirements. Chol Mishpatav, all of the laws that apply to it. Vayivneu Sheva Shanim. It took Shlomo 7 years. It's a little less than 7 years, because from Iyar to Cheshvan, you don't have a complete 7 years, but it took almost 7 years to build it. I just want to mention one little ha'ara that's bothering me, and that is, Chazal commonly say that the Jewish people remained in Eretz Yisrael a total of 850 years. They make a cheshbon, 850 years. And the cheshbon is this, that the Beis HaMikdash wasn't built until 480 from Yitzias Mitzrayim, which is 440 from the time we came to Eretz Yisrael. And the first Beis HaMikdash was 410 years. So if you add 440 and 410, you get 850. But I actually have a kasha, because the 440 is 440 years until we began to build the Beis HaMikdash. But there were 7 more years till it was completed, and then you have 410. So the 410, l'chaira, starts when you've completed the Beis HaMikdash. So if you add together 440 until we started, and then we worked for 7 years, and then 410, you don't have 850, you actually have 857 years. So I have a bit of a tzorachim, because Chazal are very, very makbid to go with the 850 years, when l'chaira there was 857 years. That's a little bit of a tzorachim. So Perek Vav, again, is a very, very difficult perek that goes through the architecture of the Bayis Rishain. B'Yezras Hashem, we have some clarity about what the picture looks like, and may we be Zaycha b'mheira v'yameinu to the Bayis Shalishi, which we will learn about in Yirtzeh Hashem when we get to Sefer Yecheskel.